At my husband's estate meeting, my daughter-in-law called me mentally unfit. She had no idea I knew about her affair. The moment she said it, the room didn't move. It was as if even the air had decided to stop breathing. I believe she is mentally unfit to make any financial or personal decisions moving forward, my daughter-in-law said calmly, placing a neat stack of documents on the polished oak table. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. That was the most dangerous part. Across from me, my son didn't look at me. He looked at the papers. Like if he avoided my eyes long enough, he wouldn't have to choose between us. And sitting between them was a man in a gray suit, the family lawyer, pretending this was just another routine estate procedure. Like he hadn't just been invited into the dismantling of my life. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. No protest, no interruption, just silence. The kind of silence people mistake for weakness. But I was watching everything. The way she didn't glance at me when she spoke. The way her hand rested just slightly too comfortably on my son's arm, as if she already belonged in his place. The way she had arranged this entire room like a stage, and I was the only one who hadn't been given a script. Then the lawyer slid another document toward me. A nursing home placement agreement, pre-filled, pre-approved, waiting only for my signature. Given concerns about cognitive stability, he said carefully, as though reading something rehearsed, this would ensure proper care and reduce any legal risk to the estate. Reduce risk. That was what I had become. A risk. My daughter-in-law leaned back slightly, crossing her legs, watching me like she was already measuring how quickly I would break. You don't have to make this difficult, Mom, she added softly, almost kindly. We're doing this for your safety. For a moment I almost smiled, not because it was kind, because it was perfect. She had practiced this. Every word, every pause, every angle of pressure, designed to make me doubt myself before I ever reached for the truth. My son finally spoke, but he still didn't look at me. Mom, maybe it's better this way, he said quietly. We just want you safe. Safe. That word again. Funny how it always shows up right before someone takes your life away from you. I looked at him then. Really looked. The boy I had raised. The boy who used to fall asleep holding my hand when he was afraid of storms. Now he couldn't even hold my gaze. My daughter-in-law exhaled gently, like we were finally getting somewhere. The lawyer pushed a pen closer to me. Once you sign, he said, we can begin the transition immediately. It will be much easier if we avoid emotional complications. Emotional complications. That was what they called a mother. I took the pen, and for the first time, my daughter-in-law smiled, just slightly, because she thought she had won, because she thought I was exactly what she had been telling everyone I was. Confused, old, manageable. I lowered my eyes to the paper, my name already printed at the bottom, waiting. But as I held that pen above the line, something inside me didn't feel broken. It felt clear, strangely clear, because while they were watching me sign away my freedom, I was remembering something she didn't know I had already discovered. Her late-night calls she thought I never noticed. The hotel charge she thought I wouldn't question. The man who wasn't my son. I signed my name slowly, carefully, and as the ink dried, I looked up at her. She thought this was the end of the conversation. She thought this was the moment I disappeared quietly into the system she built for me. But I had already seen enough, and I finally understood something very important. She wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to erase me, and I was no longer interested in being erased. The moment I walked out of that estate meeting, no one stopped me. No one called my name. No one even asked if I was okay. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the documents, not the word mentally unfit, but the fact that I could leave a room full of family and become completely invisible within seconds. The house was quiet when I got back. Too quiet. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence that comes after loss. It was the kind of silence that feels arranged, as if someone had removed every sound that still belonged to me. My husband's coat was still hanging by the door. I reached out and touched it without thinking. Still warm in memory, but not in life. It had been 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks since I had stood beside his grave and felt like part of my own body had been buried with him. But grief was not the only thing growing inside this house. Something else was forming. Slowly, carefully, like a decision already made without me. My son started visiting less. At first, it was small excuses. Work, meetings, traffic. Then it became silence. When he did come, he didn't come alone anymore. She always came with him. My daughter-in-law. Always smiling too quickly. Always looking around the house like she was already deciding what stayed and what didn't. "I think you should rest more, Mom," she said one afternoon, placing a glass of water in front of me without asking. "I'm resting," I replied. She smiled gently, but there was no warmth in it. "I just mean, you've been forgetting things lately." That word again. Forgetting. As if repetition could turn a lie into truth. My son didn't correct her. He just stood there, scrolling on his phone, nodding slightly, like he was agreeing with a conversation he wasn't fully listening to. That was the first time I realized something had shifted between them. She didn't just stand beside him anymore. She spoke through him. Days passed like that. Small comments, careful suggestions, invisible rewrites of my life spoken out loud in front of me. She repeated that story yesterday. She left the stove on last week. She asked me the same question twice. None of it was true. But repetition has a way of building its own reality. I began noticing things missing. My spare house key, some of my mail, a folder of medical documents I had placed in the kitchen drawer. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law tilted her head slightly, as if I had asked something sweetly confused. "Oh, I think you moved them, Mom." Moved them. Not stolen, not taken. Just moved. That was how she did it. Nothing direct. Nothing you could grab hold of. Just enough uncertainty to make you doubt your own memory. And slowly, I started noticing something worse. My son began looking at me differently. Not with anger, not with love, but with concern that didn't feel earned, like I had already become a problem he hadn't agreed to have. One evening, I overheard them in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to listen. I was simply walking past. But her voice stopped me. "She can't stay here alone like this," she said softly. A pause. Then my son. "She's still my mother." "I know," she replied gently. "That's why we need to do something before something happens." Before something happens. That sentence stayed in my chest long after they went quiet. Because it wasn't a question, it was a plan. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where my husband used to read the newspaper every morning, the same armchair where he used to fall asleep without realizing it. I looked around and realized something painful. This house was still full of my memories, but I was no longer part of the decisions being made inside it. And somewhere between grief and silence, my place in my own life had started to disappear. Not all at once, but carefully, like someone removing pieces of furniture from a room while I was still sitting in it. And I finally understood what my daughter-in-law was doing. She wasn't rushing. She was building a story where I didn't trust myself. A story where my son had no choice but to believe her. A story where I would eventually sign away everything willingly. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house breathe without me. And for the first time since my husband died, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what she was trying to take. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where nothing should feel wrong. But I woke up with the strange feeling that my house was no longer just a place I lived in. It was a place I was being observed inside. My daughter-in-law arrived before noon. She didn't knock the way family knocks. She used the spare key. That alone made something tighten inside my chest. She smiled when she saw me in the kitchen. Too quickly. Too practiced. "Good morning, Mom," she said, placing a paper bag on the counter. "I brought you groceries. I wasn't sure if you had enough at home." I looked at the bag. I didn't ask for groceries. "I have food," I said calmly. She nodded, still smiling. "I know. I just thought it would be easier, since you've been forgetting to shop lately." There it was again. That word. Forgetting. I watched her move through my kitchen like she belonged there more than I did. She opened cabinets, checked the fridge, adjusted things slightly, as if correcting a mistake I hadn't noticed I made. My son arrived an hour later. He looked tired. Not physically tired, emotionally delayed, like he had been repeating the same conversation in his head for days. "Mom," he said carefully, "can we talk for a minute?" She didn't leave the room. That was the first sign. Instead, she stood near the sink, quietly folding a dish towel, like she had every right to stay. Like this conversation was already partially hers. My son hesitated before speaking again. "Some of your bills weren't paid on time," he said. I blinked. "That's not true," I replied. My daughter-in-law sighed softly. "Not dramatic. Controlled. That's what I was worried about," she said, looking at him instead of me. "She doesn't remember." I turned to her. I remember perfectly. She nodded slowly, like she was humoring me, but she didn't correct herself. She didn't need to. My son looked confused now, not angry, worse, uncertain. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice just slightly. Maybe we should talk about getting her evaluated, she said. The word hung in the air like something heavy being placed on a table. Evaluated. Not help. Not support. Evaluated. My son didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than his words ever could, because silence is where decisions are made before they are spoken. I looked at him carefully. This is about the estate meeting, isn't it? I asked. His eyes flickered. A reaction too small for anyone else to notice. But I saw it. And so did she, because her expression changed immediately after. Just slightly. Like she realized I was not as far gone as she wanted him to believe. No, Mom, she said softly. This is about your well-being. But her voice had sharpened underneath, a thin layer of impatience hiding behind care. After they left that day, I checked my paperwork. Everything I could find. Bank statements, medical records, insurance mail, but something was wrong. A folder I clearly remembered placing in the kitchen drawer was gone. Not misplaced. Not moved. Gone. That was the moment I stopped telling myself this was just concern. Because concern does not enter your home quietly and start removing parts of your life. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, listening to the refrigerator hum, listening to the house exist without asking for my permission. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud before. My daughter-in-law wasn't trying to convince my son. She was rebuilding reality around him, piece by piece, memory by memory, until I became the version of me that justified everything she wanted to do next. And once that version was complete, the rest would be easy. Too easy. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time in years, and I understood something I didn't want to understand. I was no longer just grieving my husband. I was living inside a story someone else was writing about me. I didn't realize it at first, but something had changed in the way I remembered things. Not because my memory was failing, but because someone had started questioning it often enough that I began questioning it myself. It started with small corrections, almost polite, almost harmless. You told me you already ate, Mom. You said that yesterday too. I think you're mixing things up again. Always spoken gently, always in front of my son. And every time, I saw the same reaction from him. A slight pause, a hesitation. Like his mind was trying to decide whether to trust me or her. That hesitation was enough. Because doubt doesn't need proof to grow. It only needs repetition. One afternoon, I went to find my medical folder again. The one with my prescriptions, appointments, and insurance details. It was no longer in the drawer where I always kept it. I checked the kitchen cabinet, then the living room shelf, then the bedroom. Nothing. When I asked my daughter-in-law, she didn't even look surprised. Oh, she said softly, I think you misplaced it again. Misplaced. That word again. She had turned my entire life into something I was always just slightly losing track of. My son overheard. He didn't say anything at first. But later that evening, he brought it up carefully, like he was walking around broken glass. Mom, maybe we should make copies of your important documents, he said. Not why did she take it, not where is it, just copies, as if the original version of me was already unreliable. That night, I sat in my bedroom longer than usual. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. It felt monitored, like even silence had been reorganized to keep me in place. I opened the drawer beside my bed and found something I hadn't looked at in years. A small envelope, my husband's handwriting on the front. I didn't remember placing it there, or maybe I had, but I had not been ready to open it before. My hands stayed still for a moment. Then I opened it. Inside was a short note. Not long, not emotional, just precise. If you ever feel like people are rewriting your reality, don't argue with them in confusion. Collect clarity instead. I read it twice, then a third time. My husband had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, he meant every one of them. And suddenly, something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Because I realized what was happening in my house wasn't just misunderstanding. It was construction. A carefully built version of me being created in real time. And I was the only one not being consulted. The next morning, my daughter-in-law arrived earlier than usual. This time with coffee, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I've been thinking, she said, as she set the cup down in front of me. Maybe it's time we talk about long-term arrangements. My son stood behind her, quiet, present, but no longer neutral. I looked at him directly. Do you agree with her? I asked. He hesitated. That same hesitation, the one that had been growing for weeks. I just think, he started, then stopped. She stepped in immediately. Your mother shouldn't be alone like this anymore, she said gently. Not harsh, not aggressive, controlled concern. The most dangerous kind. I looked at both of them, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a direction. One they expected me to follow quietly. My son finally spoke again. We just want what's best for you. That sentence again. What's best for you? I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood something important. They were no longer trying to convince me. They were trying to outnumber me. And I realized something else in that moment. If I kept defending myself in their version of reality, I would lose myself inside it. So I stopped arguing, not because I had given up, but because I had started paying attention instead. And for the first time since my husband died, I stopped trying to be understood and started preparing to understand them. It happened during a normal conversation. That was what made it dangerous. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just words, placed carefully into my life like small nails being hammered into wood. My son came alone that morning, for the first time in weeks. I noticed that immediately. No daughter-in-law behind him, no controlled smile filling the space before he even spoke. Just him, and something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Uncertainty, mixed with rehearsal, like he had already practiced what he was about to say. Mom, he started, sitting down across from me. We think it might be time to consider some help at home. I didn't respond right away. I already knew what help meant in their vocabulary. It never meant support. It meant replacement. He continued carefully. She's been worried about you. I've been noticing some things too. There it was. The shift. From her voice to our concern. That was how it spread. Quietly. Like a decision being handed from one person to another until no one remembered who made it first. What things? I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation again. It's just, you've been forgetting appointments, misplacing things, small stuff, but still. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, because I already understood what was happening. They weren't describing my behavior. They were building a pattern, a story that sounded reasonable when repeated often enough. And my daughter-in-law was very good at repetition. When he left that day, I stayed seated for a long time, not because I was confused, but because I was finally seeing the structure behind everything. Every missing document, every corrected memory, every gentle suggestion. It wasn't random, it was directional. Each moment was pushing me toward the same conclusion. I could no longer live alone. That evening, I went through every room in the house again, slowly. Not searching for anything specific, searching for what was missing. And I found it in the smallest details. The way my spice jars had been rearranged. The way my mail had been opened before I saw it. The way my son now spoke to me like someone fragile rather than familiar. And most importantly, the way I had started doubting myself before I even finished a thought. That was when I stopped. Because I realized something I didn't want to admit. If I continued living like this, I would eventually become the version of me they were describing. Not because it was true, but because it was repeated often enough to replace truth. The next morning, my daughter-in-law arrived again. This time with a folder. She placed it on the table without sitting down. I spoke with someone, she said softly. A specialist in senior care planning. My son followed her in. Silent. Present. Aligned. The word aligned was what I noticed most. Not because he agreed out loud, but because he no longer questioned her in front of me. She opened the folder. Neatly printed documents. Facility options. Medical assessments. Financial breakdowns. Everything prepared in advance. Like my life had already been scheduled without my participation. We just need your signature to start the evaluation process, she said gently. Evaluation. That word again. Not accusation, not removal, just evaluation. Soft enough to sound reasonable, strong enough to become irreversible. My son stepped forward slightly. Mom, it's temporary, he said, just to make sure everything is okay. I looked at him for a long moment. This was still my son, but he was no longer standing in the place where I could reach him easily. Something had been placed between us, carefully, repeatedly, until it became distance that felt natural. I looked at the documents, then at her. She wasn't watching me like before. This time, she was watching the pen. Not my face, not my reaction, just the pen. Because she already believed the outcome was decided. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. This was never about helping me. It was about proving something about me. Something she needed others to believe before she moved to the next step. And I finally saw the next step. Once I signed, it would no longer be a suggestion. It would be a system I would enter voluntarily and exit without control. I placed my hands on the table, slowly, deliberately, and I said something I had not said since this began. No. The room didn't react immediately, because they weren't used to that answer. Not from me. My daughter-in-law blinked once. Just once. My son frowned slightly. "Mom," he started, but I raised my hand gently. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just enough to stop the conversation from continuing on its pre-written path. "I will not sign anything today," I said. Silence followed. Not the kind from grief, the kind from disruption, because I had broken the pattern. And in that moment, I saw it clearly in her eyes. Not anger, not panic, calculation. Because she was already adjusting, already rewriting, already preparing the next version of the story where my refusal was not resistance, but evidence. After I said no, the room didn't break. It reorganized. That was the only way I can describe it. No shouting, no reaction, no immediate confrontation, just a shift in energy. Like everyone quietly recalculating what kind of person I was becoming. My daughter-in-law closed the folder slowly, not angrily, carefully, as if even the sound of paper could be used against her if she rushed it. My son looked at me like he was trying to find the version of me he had already accepted losing. "Mom," he said again, softer this time, "we're just trying to help." But I noticed something different. He didn't say, "You're right." He didn't say, "We understand." He said, "We're trying." That small difference told me everything, because trying meant the decision was already made. They were just waiting for my cooperation. My daughter-in-law stepped back slightly, creating space between us. That was new. She was no longer pushing forward. She was repositioning. "I think we should give her some time," she said gently to my son. But her eyes stayed on me, and in those eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Not confidence, not control, adjustment. Like she had just encountered a variable she hadn't fully accounted for. They left that afternoon without further argument. But I knew it wasn't over. It had simply changed form. After they left, I sat alone in the living room for a long time. The same room where my husband used to read every evening. The same room where silence once felt peaceful. Now it felt structured, like even the quiet had instructions. I replayed everything in my mind. Not emotionally, practically. Every conversation, every missing document, every repeated suggestion, every moment my son stopped looking directly at me. And I saw the pattern clearly now. This wasn't spontaneous concern, it was coordinated reinforcement. She would say something, he would echo it later. A professional would validate it. And eventually, I would become the only person disagreeing with a consensus. That was the system. And the system was already running. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I was finally aware. There is a difference between confusion and clarity you are not allowed to act on yet. At around 2 a.m., I got up and walked through the house again, quietly, not searching for objects this time, searching for behavior. I checked the hallway where my mail used to sit. Empty. I checked the kitchen counter. Clean. Too clean. Even the small clutter of daily life had been managed. Someone had been maintaining order in my absence of control. And then I saw it. My daughter-in-law's handwriting on a small sticky note near the phone. A reminder for me. Or rather, a reminder about me. Doctor appointment confirmed. Do not forget. I stared at it for a long time, because I hadn't forgotten anything. But someone needed that sentence to exist, so that others could believe it. The next morning, I called the clinic myself. Just to confirm, the receptionist paused, then said something that made my stomach tighten slightly. "Yes, your daughter-in-law rescheduled your appointment last week. She said you preferred afternoons because mornings were confusing for you." Confusing. Again. That word. It wasn't even an insult anymore. It was becoming my identity. When I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt something sharper. Awareness. Because now I understood the real structure. They didn't need me to be incapable. They only needed me to appear inconsistent long enough for others to stop trusting my consistency. That was enough. That afternoon, my son came alone again. He looked more tired than before. Not physically, morally. Like he had been absorbing too many versions of the same story without being allowed to question any of them. "She thinks you should reconsider," he said carefully. I didn't ask who she was. We both already knew. Instead, I asked something else. "Have you ever actually seen me forget anything?" He hesitated. Not long, but long enough. And that hesitation again told me everything I needed. Because truth does not hesitate. Only belief does. "I just want peace between everyone," he said finally. Peace. Another dangerous word. Because peace, in their version, required my silence. I nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in understanding. And for the first time, I realized something very important. I was no longer in a disagreement. I was in a narrative war, and they were winning not by force, but by repetition. That evening, I sat at my husband's old desk. I opened a blank notebook, and I began writing everything down. Not for them, not to convince anyone, but to preserve what was still real before it got rewritten again. It started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I had been sitting in the kitchen, writing in my notebook again. Not because I was afraid anymore, but because I had begun to understand something important. If someone is building a version of you that isn't real, you don't fight it with emotion. You fight it with record. That was when I heard my daughter-in-law's voice through the hallway. She wasn't trying to be loud. She didn't need to be. "I've already spoken to him," she said softly. A pause. Then my son's voice. "Are you sure this is necessary?" Another pause. And then her reply. "Do you want her to stay like this forever?" Like this. Not who she is. Not your mother. Just like this. I closed my notebook slowly, because I understood what "like this" meant. It meant whatever version of me she had already built inside his mind. I stayed still, listening. "She agreed to the evaluation," she continued, "but she's starting to resist again. That's why we need structure." Structure. That word again. She had stopped using persuasion. She was now using systems. And my son, he didn't interrupt her. That was the part that hurt in a different way. Not betrayal, but permission. After the call ended, I didn't move for a long time because something had shifted. I was no longer just being misunderstood. I was being managed. That afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I left the house, alone. No explanation, no announcement, just my keys and the notebook in my bag. I went to a small cafe 2 blocks away, a place where no one knew my daughter-in-law's version of me. I sat by the window and watched people move through their lives without being rewritten, and for the first time in weeks, I could think clearly. I opened my notebook again, and I wrote one sentence at the top. "They are not reacting to who I am. They are reacting to what they have agreed I am." That sentence changed everything, because it meant the problem was not confusion. It was agreement. A private agreement between my son, my daughter-in-law, and whoever they had already spoken to. A version of reality where I was slowly becoming unnecessary. When I returned home that evening, I noticed something immediately. A new manila folder on the dining table, neatly placed, waiting. My daughter-in-law was already there. Of course she was. My son stood beside her, less certain than before, more tired. "This is the final step before assessment," she said gently. Final step. I didn't open the folder. I already knew what was inside. Instead, I looked at my son. "Did you read it?" I asked. He hesitated. Again. Then nodded. That was enough. Because hesitation meant he was no longer choosing blindly. He was choosing slowly. And slow choices are the hardest to undo. "I just want you to be safe, Mom," he said quietly. Safe again. That word that had started all of this. My daughter-in-law stepped forward slightly. Her voice softened, but her eyes didn't. "We're not trying to take anything from you," she said. "We're trying to protect what's left." What's left? As if I were already partially gone. As if this was just a matter of finishing the process. I finally looked at the folder, then at her, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to fully accept until now. This was no longer about care, or concern, or even control. This was about replacement. Replacing my judgment with theirs. Replacing my voice with documentation. replacing my presence with procedure. And once that was complete, there would be nothing left to argue with. I closed the folder without signing. Slowly, deliberately. My daughter-in-law's expression changed for the first time. Not anger, not shock. Something sharper. Concern breaking through control. Because she realized something important too. I was no longer reacting the way they expected. My son stepped forward. "Mom," he said again, but stopped. Because now even he could feel it. The pattern was breaking, and once a pattern breaks, it cannot be quietly restored. That night, I didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't because I felt trapped. It was because I had finally stopped accepting the role they had written for me. And for the first time since my husband died, I began to prepare for what came after the story they were telling about me. They chose the time carefully. Late afternoon, when the light in the house becomes softer, when people naturally feel more tired, more compliant, more willing to agree just to end the conversation. My daughter-in-law arrived first. Of course she did. She placed a glass of water in front of me without asking, then sat down like she had done this 100 times before. My son came a few minutes later. He didn't look at me immediately. That was new. Before, he still tried. Now he was already halfway somewhere else before the conversation even started. And then came the lawyer. Again. Different folder this time. Thicker. He placed it on the table with practiced neutrality. "This is the final capacity assessment agreement," he said. "Once signed, it allows us to proceed without further delay." Without further delay. That was the phrase they liked most. Because it made removal sound like efficiency. Not decision, not consequence. Efficiency. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly. Her voice was softer than before, almost compassionate. "We don't want this to be painful for you," she said. "We just need you to cooperate. Cooperate, not choose, not agree, cooperate." My son finally looked at me, but not fully, not directly. Like he was afraid that if he looked too long, he might remember something he had already decided to forget. "Mom, please," he said quietly. "We can make this easier, if you just sign." That word again. Easier. Everything was always easier if I stopped resisting. I looked at the document, then at the pen placed beside it. It was already positioned, already waiting for my hand to complete what they had arranged. But something was different this time, because I was no longer reading the paper like a participant. I was reading it like evidence. And evidence has a different weight when you stop trying to survive it and start understanding it. My daughter-in-law noticed the pause. It was small, but enough. Her expression tightened just slightly, not visible to my son, but visible to me, because I was finally watching her the way she had been watching me. "I think we should give you some privacy," she said suddenly, standing up. That was the first mistake, because privacy is what people offer when they think they already own the outcome. My son hesitated, then stood too. The lawyer gathered his papers. The room began to empty, just like they expected it to, just like every step before had trained it to. But before they reached the door, I spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. "Sit down." They stopped. Not because I demanded it, but because I didn't sound like someone asking. It took a moment. Then my son turned slightly, confused. My daughter-in-law didn't move. She studied me instead, carefully, like something she thought was stable had just shifted position. I opened my notebook, placed it on the table. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough for them to see. "I've written everything," I said. Silence. The lawyer frowned slightly. My daughter-in-law's expression changed first. Not panic. Calculation again. Always calculation. "What is that supposed to mean?" she asked softly. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't try to sound reasonable. "I know about the evaluations," I said. Pause. "I know about the calls you made." Another pause. "I know about the way you've been describing me." My son stepped forward slightly. "Mom, what are you talking about?" That was the first time he sounded genuinely unsettled, because uncertainty is different when it comes from you instead of being given to you. I turned the notebook slightly, not to show them everything, just enough. Names, dates, quotes, patterns. "She's been documenting everything," I said calmly. "Every time I was called forgetful, every time something was moved, every time I was spoken about as if I wasn't in the room." My daughter-in-law's breathing changed. Barely. But I noticed. Because now I was no longer the subject of her control. I was the record of it. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This doesn't change the legal process," he said carefully. I nodded. I know. Then I looked at my son, directly this time, fully. For the first time in weeks, he didn't look away immediately. And I saw it. Not full belief, not full doubt, but something breaking open between both. And I understood something important. They had expected me to sign, or collapse, or argue, but they had not expected me to remember accurately. My daughter-in-law finally spoke again. Her voice was lower now. Controlled, but thinner. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I almost smiled, because that sentence confirmed everything. Complicated. Not false, not wrong. Complicated. Meaning I was interfering with a version of reality that required me to stay quiet. I closed the notebook, slowly, and said the only thing that mattered. Then I think it's time you both hear what actually happened, from the beginning. The room didn't move for a long time. After I said it, then I think it's time you both hear what actually happened, from the beginning. No one spoke. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law, not even the lawyer. Because there is a specific kind of silence that appears when people realize the story they prepared for is no longer the story being told. My daughter-in-law was the first to adjust. Of course she was. She leaned back slightly, folding her hands, trying to return to control. This isn't necessary, she said softly. We're trying to help you, not argue with you. Help. That word again. I looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't feel pressured to defend myself. I felt clear. I know about the man you've been meeting, I said calmly. Her expression didn't change immediately. But something in her eyes tightened. Small, invisible to anyone who didn't know her well. But I did. I continued. The hotel charges, the messages, the afternoons when you told my son you were with me. Now the silence changed. It became heavier. My son turned slowly toward her, not fully understanding yet, but beginning to. That's not, she started quickly, but I didn't let her finish. I also know about the lawyer you contacted before the estate meeting, I said. A pause. And the conversations about placing me into care before anyone even spoke to me about it. Now the lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, because professionals don't like being mentioned inside truths they were not prepared for. My son looked at him, then back at her. For the first time, he wasn't reacting. He was processing. That was the shift she had been avoiding. Because she could control emotion, but she couldn't control recognition. I didn't want to believe it, my son said quietly, almost to himself. My daughter-in-law immediately turned toward him. Her voice softened again. Faster now, urgent underneath the calm. You know how she gets things wrong, she said gently. This is exactly what we were worried about. But something had changed in his face. Not fully broken, not fully convinced, but no longer stable in her direction, and that was enough. I opened my notebook again. Not dramatically, just enough for him to see the structure. Not accusations, patterns, dates, repeated phrases, times when I was described as forgetful, at moments I was not present. Times when decisions were made about me without me. And finally, copies of what I had confirmed myself. Real information, not interpretation, verification. I didn't argue, I said quietly, because I wanted to understand how far this would go. My daughter-in-law's breathing became shallower. The control she had built was no longer landing the same way. Because control only works when the person it's built on stops documenting it. My son looked at me for a long moment. Really looked. Not as a mother he was protecting, not as a problem he was solving, but as a person he had stopped fully seeing. And I could tell the exact moment the story inside him began to fracture. Not collapse, just crack. You told me she was confused, he said quietly, turning slightly toward his wife. Her answer came too fast, too practiced. I said she was overwhelmed. There's a difference. But he didn't respond immediately, because now he was hearing language instead of believing it. And language is where manipulation starts to lose power. I closed the notebook, slowly, and said the final truth. She didn't convince you because I was confused, I said. She convinced you because you wanted the explanation to be simple. Silence. The lawyer quietly pushed his chair back. He understood something important had shifted beyond paperwork. My daughter-in-law looked at me now differently, not as someone to manage, but as someone who had already stepped outside the version of me she built. And for the first time, there was no smile, no calm voice, just something raw underneath. Because she realized something too late. The story she created no longer held everyone. My son finally spoke again, His voice was lower, unsteady. Why didn't you tell me sooner? That question landed differently. Not accusation, not defense. Confusion. Real confusion. I looked at him, and for the first time since this began, I let my voice soften. Because I wanted you to see it without me guiding you, I said. A pause. And now you have. The room stayed still, but the direction had changed. Not violently, not dramatically, but irreversibly. My daughter-in-law looked between us, realizing she was no longer the center of alignment. Not anymore. And that was when I understood the final truth of everything. She never needed me gone because I was fragile. She needed me gone because I was still accurate. I closed the notebook one last time and stood up, not as someone defending her place, but as someone no longer asking permission to remain in it. I will not be signing anything, I said calmly. No more meetings without me knowing. No more decisions about my life without my voice in the room. I looked at my son, and for the first time, he didn't look away. Not fully, not yet whole, but present. And that was enough. Because some endings are not about winning. They are about being seen clearly again after being rewritten for too long. I picked up my notebook and walked out of the room. Not as someone they had to take care of, not as someone they had to manage, but as someone they could no longer define without truth pushing back. In the end, I didn't lose my mind, and I didn't lose my memory. What I lost was the illusion that family cannot be rewritten by silence and repetition. I learned that when people stop defending your truth, they will slowly replace it with a version that serves them. But I also learned something more important. Clarity returns the moment you stop asking to be believed and start standing in what you already know. I didn't leave that house because I was pushed out. I left because I finally saw everything clearly enough to no longer stay quietly erased.